So this talk is on terrifying film music and how it mimics an alarming acoustic feature of human screams. And this is the talk I gave recently at Timbre 2020 well, kind of technically in Greece, but it was online, of course. So why research scary music? Where does this talk even come from? And this comes from a larger project that I'm working on called Emotional Musical Signals, and it is focused on fear. So information communicated by music, which I'm just going to call musical signals, is often studied from two distinct perspectives in music cognition work. It's either studied really from the cultural perspective, and this is usually coming from the humanities side, so music theory or musicology, or it's studied as more of a biological signal, and this is more from people who have more of a psychology background. And so with cultural studies of musical signals, there's usually this sort of branch of music theory called topic theory, and they look at combinations of musical elements that we grow to associate with specific contexts or situations, or emotions. So this is kind of how film music operates. Usually something like a march where you hear a very specific rhythm with brass instruments playing in a major key kind of gives you the impression of a march, which might connect to experiences you've had watching parades, maybe watching a sports event, and that brings kind of positive emotions. So that's the cultural side of musical signals. And then the biological side, often scholars are looking for ethological signals in music. And ethological signals are their behaviors intended to communicate with a fellow member of your species. So in humans, ethological signals are laughter, screams, crying, and there are other ones, and they are really intended to communicate to a fellow human that you need something, you want them to act in a certain way back to you. So these are two sides, and what I noticed is often this research is really separately done. So usually cultural is all they focus on, or they only focus on some biological aspects of music. So this research program is supposed to fill that gap and look at both cultural and ethological signals, in particular for musical fear signals. So why music and fear? There's comparatively less research on music and fear and music and emotion research. It exists as usually one of the categories studied, but also it's usually separated into, or it's usually studied as one general category. But if you look at research on fear in terms of neuroscience studies, it's actually more likely separated into two different types of fear. Maybe not even just two, there could be multiple types, but I wanted to at least separate it into terror and anxiety in my work. Also, if you look at the previous work on music and fear, the stimuli is usually kind of a small selection, or it's not really been validated. It's sort of selected on the fly. And it's also usually just general fear music instead of these categories that I think are really important. Also, music for fear is more directly linked to ethological signals, I think, than any other emotion. Some of these other comparisons between voice and music, for instance, like in music and sadness or in music and happiness, are much more abstract and complicated. Whereas I think this music for fear, like scary movie soundtracks, uses a lot of sound effects, and it's almost, a lot of people would probably debate if it even counts as music sometimes. So it's much more closely linked to direct signaling than these kind of more abstract genres of music and emotion. So the objectives of the larger project are to create a database of fearful musical excerpts that are separated into anxiety, validated for their efficacy. And then I'm using methods in neuroscience to investigate some potential ethological signals in scary music, to look at cultural signals, and then all these results will be synthesized into a larger report on just how music communicates fear whole. So this project I'm presenting today is very much part of that first objective. So we're looking at creating databases of fearful musical excerpts and investigating some of the acoustic aspects of these databases. So for this project, I was back in grad school, I was doing some research on Bernard Herrmann, the composer for Hitchcock. And I was looking at a lot of scary music and reading reviews of scary music. And I realized there's very often this comparison of it sounding scream-like in scary film music. So for example, there's this really famous cue from Psycho by Bernard Herrmann, which one reviewer called this screeching upward glissandi. So this is the cue when the woman is murdered in the shower that most people know, but I'm gonna go ahead and play it now. Hopefully it works. So very classic and scream-like. But this cue is not just limited to that time period in film music. It's very much used today. It's throughout several genres, not even just the horror film genre, but I particularly focused on horror films. So this is from the film It Follows, which is much more recent, in 2015, I think it came out, or 2014. And the music is by Disaster Piece. It's very electronic. It's not string-based like the other score. And this reviewer described it as this one particularly scary excerpt as sounding like fire alarm-like screeches. So we'll listen to that. So you can hear, even though it's electronic, there's a lot of similarity to that original Hitchcock or Herrmann cue written, 55 years or so before this cue. Also, another cue that was described as screaming was this one from The Shining, and this piece is actually a classical music piece called Polymorphia by Penderecki. It's used in, I think, a few horror films, but this is the most famous example, and was described by one film reviewer as a screaming, discombobulating climax of mind-bending power, which is the funnest or most interesting description I've found. So here's an example of this. It's a little bit different than the other two, but it still has that same kind of wall of sound quality, chaos, really rich spectral quality that the other two also contain. So my question when I was listening to these and reading these reviews was, do these scary film music soundtrack excerpts actually sound like human screams? How literal is this comparison that I was seeing so frequently? And there's this interesting trend in music where we often use vocal behaviors to describe musical ones. This is very ubiquitous throughout music history. So, for example, as I mentioned before, there's this branch of music theory called topic theory, and they're the ones that kind of categorize collections of musical characteristics based on their cultural associations. And they have this one label they call the pianto topic or the sigh topic. And it's this falling half-step motive that you hear a lot in classical music, and it's supposed to mimic the sound of human weeping or sighs. So that's just one example from kind of music theory world. Music pedagogues use vocal descriptions very frequently to describe to their students how they should play. So play this passage more like a singingly, play it more laughingly, play it more like it's crying. This is really common in music pedagogy, and composers also write expressive instructions sometimes at the top of their pieces that allude to the voice, such as cantabile, which means singingly, or sospirando, which is sighing. So it's a really common behavior in music to rely on vocal behaviors to describe how you should play something expressively, especially. And some music cognition scholars empirically investigate the validity of these comparisons. So they look into how much is this actual behavior mimicking laughter, or how much is this actual behavior related to the sound of crying, or grief music related to crying. And so usually they categorize this type of work as looking for ethological signals in music, which I described before. So they're those behaviors that are intended to communicate with a fellow member of your species, and especially meant to provoke a certain reaction. So, if you're interested in this connection between cues and or ethological signals in music, there's a good article on this by David Huron from 2015. So this idea is that maybe part of how music communicates emotion is that it mimics these human ethological vocal signals. So that goes back to my question here for this project is, does scary music actually mimic human screams in order to scare us? Is that how it functions as a signal? Now, screams have some interesting acoustic features. They're loud, obviously. They usually have a very wide range of frequencies, even though generally they're higher in pitch, and they have a high amount of roughness. And I'm going to focus in especially on this roughness because those other qualities, loud, wide range of frequency, higher in pitch, those can be ascribed to other vocal signals such as laughter, maybe crying. So really this roughness is a very particular one for screams, which is really convenient for this study. It's kind of, you can think of roughness as this coarse, grating, or harsh sound. And there are several ways you can measure and quantify roughness, but we chose to use this modulation power spectrum measurement. And that was inspired by this paper by Luc Arnault et al. From 2015. It's this one. So that human screams occupy a privileged niche in the communication soundscape. So this paper was really, really well timed for this question, because what they did was they wanted to understand what makes scream such a unique and therefore effective signal in human communication. And they used the modulation power spectrum to analyze screams, and they found that screams have this really specific, they occupy a really specific niche of the modulation power spectrum that actually previously people had disregarded as not useful for human communication, which was interesting. And this region is described as the roughness region. I'll show a little bit more about the MPS in just a moment. But just to complete the summary of this study, they used some behavioral tasks and FMRI, and they showed that acoustic roughness actually engages parts of the brain that are associated with appraising danger. So all the results together sort of demonstrated that screams occupy this really privileged niche of the MPS, and that by occupying that, it is separate from other communication signals and therefore really ensures its biological and social efficiency, like communicating with humans. So that's why roughness seemed like the perfect cue to investigate in this potentially scream-like music. So modulation power spectrum, maybe you guys are more familiar with it than the average audience that I can talk to. It's a two-dimensional fast Fourier transform of a spectrogram. So you essentially do the 2D FFT twice is how you get this measurement. It shows you the irregularity of a sound, and mainly it gives you the power of the temporal and spectral modulations at the same time. The way I like to think about it, because I honestly struggle sometimes to wrap my head around all the math of this measurement, is that it gives you a sort of fingerprint of the sound. So it's a really a more effective identification of the general timbral aspects of a sound than just pitch or loudness or other measurements that we can take. So it's a really efficient kind of identification. So just to demonstrate, you have this waveform, and then you do an FFT, 2D FFT, and you get the spectrogram. So you see the spectral information in the sound, and then you do it again, and you get the modulation power spectrum. Oh, somehow my PowerPoint quit. I'm so sorry. 1 second. Don't send. It will take just a moment to open this again.
Your PowerPoint presentation got scared.
Yeah. It had enough of this topic. Can you see it again?
Yes.
Oh, we're going to get some sounds. Some music. We were here. Excellent. Okay, sorry about that. So there's just some more details on the modulation power spectrum, showing you there's the temporal modulation aspect. So this is the x-axis, and that shows you the frequency of the amplitude modulation of the sound. And the y-axis is giving you the spectral modulation. So it's measuring the kind of frequency at which the spectral content is changing, as far as I understand it. And the color on a spectrogram, you probably know that that's representing the sound intensity at these different frequencies over time. Whereas on the MPS graph, it's representing the power or magnitude of that particular occurrence of temporal modulation and spectral modulation. So it's similar, but it's about the power rather than the intensity, sound intensity. So there's different areas of the modulation power spectrum. When you're analyzing voice, they communicate different things. So there's part of it that is just the slow fluctuations of actual speech and meaning. Part of it represents sort of the pitch areas of gender. And then if you look on this, you see how there's the orange areas, and that's the roughness region. So this is the zone that was previously thought to not communicate anything in human speech of importance. But Luc Arnault's paper suggests that this is actually a cue area for danger, which is interesting. So you can also see this is from their paper. They looked at screaming sentences and normal sentences, and you can see how normally spoken sentences don't activate that region, whereas the screams really, really did. So we wanted to see if that would happen with music as well. Here I have another example, so you can really see the waveform converted to the spectrogram. You can already see a huge difference between this fearful scream and this neutral scream. The neutral scream is more of like a held ah sound. That's why the spectral information is really consistent across the spectrogram. And then you can see in this, oh, there's a demonstration of it. Those are the two sounds. I wanted to show you the red borders for this. So this, you can see the roughness zone is really lit up for the scream, whereas for the neutral scream, it's not there. So we had to go back to our question. We were looking at whether scream-like music is going to be mimicking human screams. So does it have the same roughness feature then as human screams? And in order to test this, we did some acoustic analyses. So we looked at the modulation power spectrum of screams, non-screams, which are like those held ah sounds, scream-like music, and non-scream-like music. And then we also did a behavioral study with valence and arousal ratings because we wanted to verify how similarly the scream-like excerpts of music are perceived to actual human screams. So just to clarify our very specific hypotheses, our first hypothesis was that the mean power of the MPS within the roughness region would be similar for screams and scream-like music, so showing that they have similar roughness features, and would be significantly greater for screams compared to non-screaming vocalizations for scream-like music compared to non-scream-like music. So we wanted to show that the scream-like category across both domains, music and voice, would have a higher amount of roughness than non-scream-like. And our second hypothesis, given our behavioral ratings task, was that roughness would correlate negatively with valence ratings and positively with arousal ratings for both music and vocal stimuli. So that would suggest that if roughness is high, then the music or voice stimuli would be perceived as more negative and also more emotionally intense, as you would expect from a scream. So this just shows you our 2x2 design. We have the music category and voice, and we have non-scream-like and non-scream-like music, non-scream-like vocalizations, scream-like music, and screams. We had 50 audio recordings of each type, so there were 200 total stimuli. All of them are pretty short. They're only 800 milliseconds in duration. If you think about how long a scream lasts, it's very short. So, and actually that's found in the music as well. If you look for scream-like music excerpts, they are very brief. They're usually not very long. So this was a nice, this made it easier to compare. They were RMS normalized and sampled at 16 kilohertz, and they were in WAV file format. Just a little more detail on how we got these stimuli. So the scream-like and non-scream-like passages were sampled from contemporary horror films. They were released in 2010 or later. Because I really wanted these results to reflect current music, current musical practice. So we looked for 5 scream-like passages and 5 non-scream-like passages from each film. And for the scream-like passages, the sampling focused on music written for really scary moments in the film. So usually this is pretty easy to find, even in the track labels, because if you're looking at the film soundtrack on Spotify or something, the track label that says, you know, someone dies or monster appears, then this is going to have probably a scream-like excerpt. The non-scream-like music excerpts were taken from scenes that were not especially terrifying, and I usually was aiming for ones that seemed emotionally neutral. So these are the films we looked for, and you can see what I was talking about if you look at some of these names, such as Jeremy Attacks. That was a pretty clear cue for me that there's probably going to be a scream-like excerpt in there, and there was. But then other scenes are just Ice-T, which is just a conversation between 2 characters, so that's a much more neutral, maybe a little bit suspenseful scene, but definitely not on the terrifying side. We actually, for the paper on this, went ahead and just listed some observed musical characteristics of each category. So when I listen through the 50 scream-like excerpts, I hear a lot of these chaotic walls of sound, kind of more like the Penderecki piece, rather than the kind of more old-fashioned version from Herman's music for Psycho. They're usually fast tempo, high, wide-ranging use of register, electronic and acoustic, but these days pretty much electronic in film music. And there's usually this kind of strained sound happening. Sometimes these are with extended techniques, which means, if you don't know what classical music terms, an extended technique is when you kind of push the instrument into a different boundary that's not typical. So sometimes on flutes, this is where they really blow really hard into the flute in a way that makes it a really distorted sound. Sometimes with cello is my instrument, and extended technique within that would be similar, would be to really push on the bow on the string and really get a rough sound that you typically don't want when you play the cello. But for this kind of a technique, this instance of creating really scream-like music, it's really effective. And the emotional impressions of these is terrifying, alarming, really stressful music. Whereas the non-scream-like, very short excerpts were typically just a held chord, usually in minor. Sometimes there would be a brief melodic fragment, but it was really short. And these were kind of narrower use of register, a lot of different instrumentation, but often just string orchestra or some kind of electronic version of string orchestra. So that's a little more detail on those musical excerpts. Also, if you really want to listen to them, they're available, oh, it happened again, on our Open Science framework, which you can find a link to in our paper. And I'm going to get this started again. It's a very old version of laptop of PowerPoint. I'm in the process of getting a new laptop, so this doesn't happen anymore. We'll go through really fast. Okay, past modulation power spectrum to our stimuli. Excellent. So the screening stimuli were recorded at the University of Zurich. This was before my time here, but they recorded 10 participants, which were gender balanced, and the mean age was about 27, so kind of a typical sample of people. And they did a acted fearful scream and then this non-screaming kind of held ah vocalization. And we feel that even though these screams were acted, that they still are a pretty good representation of screams to study. In previous studies, acted screams have actually been judged to resemble real life ones to a high degree. So we felt like they were adequate. And our methodology for the acoustic analysis was we used MATLAB to analyze the MPS of each excerpt to measure the MPS. This was exactly the same method as Luc Arnal used in his 2015 paper, which I'll show you a bit more about in a moment. And then we took the mean amplitude of the roughness range of 30 to 150 hertz along the temporal modulation range. So that was that roughness zone that I pointed out before. And this is just an excerpt from the extended or the supplementary section of the Arnal 2015 paper. So if you really want to, if you're interested in using the modulation power spectrum, I think this is a really good summary of the code. When I looked through the line by line, it's doing exactly as they describe in this paragraph. So if you are curious, I would go there to see more. The ratings experiment was 20 participants from UZH, and they received 15 francs for their participation, and it was approved by the local ethics committee. They listened to all 200 audio files in a pseudo-randomized order, so it was no more than, I think, 3 of the same type in a row, and randomized otherwise. And they rated, after they heard each audio file, they rated the valence from -3 being extremely negative to +3, extremely positive, and the arousal from 1 to 7 of each conveyed, of the conveyed emotion of each audio file. And this experiment was created with Psych Toolbox in MATLAB. Oh man. Oh no, this is, okay, it didn't crash, it's just telling me that's not as bad. Now I can skim down here. I'm so sorry about this. There we go. We good? Okay. So our results, we did some standard linear regression analyses. So for our first hypothesis, the results demonstrate a significant main effect between scream-likeness and roughness, driven by higher roughness values for scream-like stimuli as compared to non-scream-like stimuli across both sound types. So this was exciting because it was consistent with our prediction. A similar effect was demonstrated with voice-only stimuli, replicating the findings of Luc Arnault in 2015 et al. Additionally, the results also showed a significant interaction effect between sound type and scream likeness, and this was driven by a more extreme difference in mean roughness values between the screaming voices and non-screaming voices compared to the scream-like music versus non-scream-like music. You can see that here. There's a much bigger difference between the voice categories than there is between the music categories. And this is also reflected in these example NPS graphs. So you can see that the human scream in the top left corner has much more activation happening in the roughness region than scream-like music in the bottom left corner. And there's still some roughness in the non-scream-like music in the bottom right corner compared to top right with the non-screaming vocalization. So that's just showing, again, this kind of difference you see in the data between the two modalities. For the second hypothesis, we also did the results using R, and we used the emotion ratings, so valence and arousal, as the predicted values for two mixed effects models, with predictor value being roughness. And we have the results here. So again, you can see kind of a similar pattern where the voice was a bit more effective, or it just has a bigger difference than the music categories. Consistent with our hypothesis, roughness correlated negatively with valence ratings and positively with arousal ratings for both stimuli, so both the musical and vocal. But there was this significant interaction effect between roughness and sound type for both categories. So the regression slope is actually steeper for vocal sounds than for musical sounds. I went ahead and looked at gender because Claudia, you asked me during my presentation at the Timbre conference of impact on the results, and actually, yeah, it does, which was really interesting, and I feel sad we didn't analyze it earlier. It seems like a missed opportunity. But if you look at just voice and you have gender as one of the predictors as well as the ratings, or gender and roughness for the ratings, you see that female voices were consistently rated as more arousing and more negative than male voices. There's a significant main effect. So that I found really interesting the other day. So in conclusion for this study, consistent with our hypothesis, screams and scream-like music both exhibited a higher level of roughness and had more negative valence ratings and higher arousal ratings than their non-screaming counterparts. But contrary to our hypothesis, screams had a higher roughness level than scream-like music. So they were not as similar as we expected, but I think the other results are in line with our hypotheses in general, that basically our results demonstrate that the greater difference in roughness levels and emotion ratings between vocal stimuli than between musical stimuli. So I talked about that already. It seems like voice is at the signaling than the music, although the music does seem to be communicating in a very similar way. So ultimately we think perhaps scream-like music is a bit muted. While it's maybe it's not as effective as the same thing, perhaps because it's a more abstract version, whereas the vocal signal has been evolutionarily really crafted to communicate clearly and efficiently, whereas music, it's a more recent kind of creation in human history and is more of an abstraction of these signals. And this is contrary to this super expressive voice theory of Useline and Vosfall, that music can kind of communicate emotion in a bigger, more effective, like more pronounced way than the voice. So that was interesting as well in our results. So yeah, that's our final kind of thought on the matter, is that scream-like music might scare viewers in part because it's evocative of a human scream. And I add that in part because I really think the cultural aspects of music are very important to the signal's efficacy as well. It's not just the biological component, it's just kind of underlying and maybe influencing the cultural creations of how music evokes emotion as well. So future work might test similar hypotheses by directly manipulating roughness cues. Actually, Luc Arnault et al. In their 2015 paper did a little bit of this as well. Or future work could investigate if our findings could be extended to other types of music that is found to induce negative emotions. So with our recent publication process, a reviewer asked if maybe we would find this in metal music. But actually, metal music is not ubiquitously described as inducing negative emotions. Like fans don't describe feeling negatively when they listen to metal music, but non-fans would. So you could investigate if this works as well with metal music, particularly for non-fans. It could be interesting. So this was recently published in case you want to look up the really gritty details of it, or in JASA. So yeah, there it is. And there's some supplemental materials as well. That's also where you can find the Open Science link if you want to download our materials. And then I guess I can have a little time to talk briefly about what's next. So going back to the objectives of my larger project, we want to use methods in neuroscience to investigate these potential ethological signals in scary music. So I'm using these exact stimuli now in an FMRI study. And the motivating questions are the neural networks activated by music for terror, which is this scream-like music typically, the same as those activated by human screams. So it's the same exact sound design as this experiment where you're doing non-scream-like music and non-scream-like vocalizations, scream-like music, and screams. We already collected data, which is exciting. So we collected 38 data from 38 participants, which were healthy, particularly non-musicians, because that's important. Musicians' brains have been shown to have some differences in reacting to music than non-musicians. And of those, we had to exclude 7 people. So we're probably going to end up with 31 data sets, which is pretty good for FMRI. What they did was they listened to all those examples, the sound examples, and they had a one-back task. So it was totally unrelated to our question. It was just, if you hear a sound repeat twice in a row, go ahead and press the button. So just to keep their attention, that's all. And it was about an hour in the scanner. I don't know if any of you are really interested in FMRI, but if you are, this is sort of the design that we used. So you do the same kind of tasks for several blocks so that you can really look at if you're noticing significant differences in the brain activity. And so during each run, or you can think of it as a block, they listen to these same music excerpts. We limited it down to, I think, 10 of each type that repeated, because you really need a lot of trials to have anything remotely interesting happening in your data. If you only have a few trials, you're not going to find results at all. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. I mean, I have some slides on the analyses. If you're really interested in this topic, I can talk about it. But otherwise, I always want to thank Lauren Sveth, and also it died, but I can do that myself. I'll just stop sharing for now. So I wanted to thank David Huron for his input on this project, and Lauren Sveth, and also Arkady Konovalov, who helped me with the statistics analysis. And yeah, I thank you so much for listening, and I really welcome any questions you have on this paper.
Thank you, Caitlyn, and thanks for adding this analysis about female versus male.
My pleasure.
So if anyone has any question, please unmute yourself and turn on your video. Hector apparently doesn't have sound. He's asking, have taken into account that the part of the brain process music is different from that process unexpected natural sounds?
Yes, thanks for asking that. So in our analyses, we are going to do a few different t-test contrasts. So I can kind of summarize that. Maybe I can even share my screen again with this slide real quick. Sure. Okay, it is working. Just need to So yeah, I'll go ahead and might as well then go through the analyses. So yes, we do take that into account for sure. The lab I'm in right now looks at a lot at the differences in voice recognition and natural sounds compared to musical sounds. So this is one of their main interests. So some of the contrasts we're going to deal with that. So we will look at fearful versus non-fearful generally across both modalities, but then we'll look at music and voice to see if how that differs. And then we'll look at musical fearful samples minus the music non-fearful samples compared to vocal fear samples minus the non-vocal fear, so that we can really look at the difference in activation between the fearfulness for both modalities, if that makes sense. So these are some general hypotheses we have, but yeah, we absolutely take into account that voice is processed typically quite a bit differently than music. Oh, I haven't stopped sharing. I hope that answers your question.
Somebody else?
The musical track and the ambient noise. This is just a good question. It's just the music, actually. So no ambient noise. And I did this by taking the music from Spotify recordings of the soundtrack rather than from the film directly. I hope that answers your question as well.
Yeah, and about this, that reminds me that there is it's very noisy in an FMRI scanner. So how do you compensate for this?
Great question. Yes, it does make it challenging to do audio tasks. We have a special pair of headphones that are noise canceling, that are FMRI safe. And they're really interesting. So we put them on their ears, and then we have these pillows that go on the outside, and we blow them up so they're really tightly around their ears. And then we have this system that learns before we scan. We hit learn, and it takes in the sound environment of the scanner for about 15 seconds into the run, and then it activates the noise canceling in response to the noise environment that it's learned. So it really clears out a lot of the sound, which is excellent. I mean, there's still a component of sound that the participants can hear, but it lowers it to a level that they can really hear the sounds pretty well. Yeah.
Because just the sound is scary, so sound of FMRI. So.
Okay, I see another question.
Rory, show your face and turn on your microphone. We can hear your voice.
No, I see in the chat a more detailed question of the MPS.
Is the MPS computed from the log frequency scale spectrogram or from the linear scale one?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the log from my memory of the code, but I have to say this is not as much my expertise as the actual computation of this. This is a big reason why Luke Garnall, I brought him on the papers. I really needed help to compute this myself. But I'm pretty sure from my memory of looking through this code, it was log frequency. Any more questions? Okay, great. In the JAZA paper, we kind of redirect to Luke's. So I would check out, especially that paragraph I posted is from the extended section of the paper. So not in the main paper, it's in the supplement. So that's where you should look.
Other questions?
If there are no more, I'd actually really love to, I should have probably asked this in the beginning to tailor my presentation a bit better on the fly, but I'd love to learn more about what your lab particularly is looking at these days, and if you guys want to share, if there are no more questions, if that's okay.
Boris is working on voice, so you should.
That's really helpful then.
No.
Scary doesn't come from the music, does it come from the context? That's a great question. In case anyone, sorry, I should read this louder than just muttering to myself. If scariness doesn't come from the music, then does it come from the context? That's a great question. Actually, there's a huge amount of people in music cognition of musical emotions that don't believe music can scare you on its own. They think it only works in film or with images. And I don't subscribe to that belief, obviously, with this research. I've listened to quite a lot of scary music. I'm really interested in movie soundtracks, and then kind of started focusing in on horror music because I think it's kind of been neglected in the literature, both in music theory and in music cognition. And I can tell you, just even listening to this music, in order to find the excerpts, I have very strong physiological responses to it. And I also don't think, some would argue when I say this then, that probably it's just because I remember what's happening during the movie for that particular music. But I also think that's not the case. If you go ahead and listen to the excerpts that I have posted in Open Science Foundation, you'll find that the music is quite similar across films, to the point where for these particular excerpts, I would not be able to tell you which film it's from or what's happening. Typically, I can do this really well, kind of scarily well, because melodic excerpts are really clear memory links. So if I just listen to a normal soundtrack from, say, Harry Potter or something, I could probably tell you exactly what scene it is and like what's happening just from a very short melody. But this music is not melodic. It doesn't have those same cues that you can really easily link to a memory. It's very similar across the board because these composers are using really codified techniques to scare you when you're watching the film. So I really do believe it's coming from the music itself. And I think part of that is because of these biological signals like screams. And I'm also looking at drone tones, which I think are mimicking these sort of looming tones that they've found even monkeys respond really strongly to as an anxiety cue. So drone tones are like really long, sustained tones that typically kind of fade in with loudness. And they're used so frequently in film music, and especially in scary, anxious music. So yeah, that's my stand on it. But I think if you ask a lot of other people in the field, they would say otherwise. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Any other question? Okay, in that case, I can stop the recording and then I can talk a bit about our lab. And if anybody wants to jump in and add, they are welcome to do so.